Deputy Speaker, I'd like to make a statement about the steps my department is taking to support education settings to respond to the risk of reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, or commonly known as Raac. Before I go into the specifics, I want to be clear that absolutely nothing is more important than the safety of children and staff. It has always been the case that where we are made aware of a building that poses an immediate risk, we've taken immediate action. Parents and children have been looking forward to starting the new term, and I understand the timing of this change in guidance to schools and colleges will have caused concern and disruption. However, faced with recent cases, including one that emerged right at the end of the school holidays, I believe 100% that this is the right thing to do, and that is why we have taken such rapid steps to support our schools and colleges. There are over 22,000 schools and colleges in England, and the vast majority of them are unaffected by Raac. Local authorities and multi-academy trusts are responsible for these buildings, but we have been supporting schools and colleges to ensure risks resulting from Raac are mitigated. To date, 52 schools and colleges have these mitigations in place. The majority have been able to continue to provide face-to-face learning without any disruption, and we remain in contact with them. Last week, we advised a further 104 schools and colleges to take spaces that are known to contain Raac out of use if they have not already done so. The majority of these settings will remain open for face-to-face learning on their existing site because only a small part of each site is affected. A minority of pupils will be fully or partially relocated to alternative accommodation to continue face-to-face learning while mitigations are put in place. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to reassure parents and children that we are taking a deliberately cautious approach to prioritising children's safety. Because of our proactive questionnaire and surveying programme, we have a better understanding of where Raac is on the school estate than in most other countries. All schools and colleges that have advised us they suspect they might have Raac will be surveyed within a matter of weeks, in many cases in a few days. Most suspected cases will not have Raac. So far, when we've surveyed schools, around 2/3 of suspected cases do not have Raac. We will follow the same approach with any new cases through the professional surveying programme. The vast majority of schools will be unaffected, and children should attend school as normal unless parents are contacted by their school. As my right honourable friend, the Minister for Schools, explained on Friday, we will publish a list of schools once mitigations are in place. It is right that parents are informed by schools if they are impacted, and that schools have time to work with their DfE caseworker on those mitigations. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am confirming today that we will publish the list of the 156 schools with confirmed cases of Raac this week, with details of initial mitigations in place. After this, we will provide updated information as new cases of Raac are confirmed and existing cases resolved. This will include updates on the impact on pupils, such as how many are learning face-to-face, how many are receiving short periods of remote education. Once again, we are doing everything in our power to minimise disruption and avoid remote learning. Madam Deputy Speaker, I must thank the professional response of leaders, teachers and support staff in the sector who have acted swiftly to deliver contingency plans. Each impacted school and college has a dedicated caseworker to help implement a mitigation plan. This could include other spaces on the school site or in nearby schools or elsewhere in the local area until structural supports or temporary buildings are installed. We have increased the supply of temporary buildings, working with 3 contractors, and accelerated the installation of these. We have the support of our leading utility companies to ensure that these classrooms can be opened. In a small number of schools with confirmed Raac, disruption to face-to-face learning has usually lasted a matter of days. In terms of funding, as the Chancellor has said, we will spend whatever it takes to keep children safe. This includes paying for emergency mitigation work to make buildings safe, including alternative classroom space where necessary. Where schools need additional help with revenue costs like transport to other locations, we are actively engaging with every school affected to put appropriate support in place. We will also fund the longer-term refurbishment or rebuilding projects where these are needed to remove Raac. Professional advice from technical experts on Raac has evolved over time. Indeed, the question of how to manage its risks across all sectors has spanned successive governments since 1994. My department alerted the sector about the potential risks of Raac in 2018 following a sudden roof collapse at a primary school. We published a warning note with the Local Government Association which asked all responsible bodies to identify any properties constructed using Raac and to ensure that Raac properties are regularly inspected by a structural engineer. In February 21, we issued a guide on how to identify Raac, concerned that not all responsible bodies were acting quickly enough. In 2022, we decided to take a more direct approach. We issued a questionnaire to responsible bodies for all 22,000 schools to ask them to identify whether or not they had or suspected Raac. Responsible bodies have submitted responses to the questionnaire for 95% of schools with blocks built in the target period. In September 22, we started a programme where DfE sends a professional surveyor to assess whether Raac is present. If Raac was present, the previous DfE guidance was to grade it as critical or non-critical and only take buildings out of use for critical Raac cases. Such was the level of our concern, however, that I asked officials to seek evidence of risks, including to non-critical Raac. It's because of this proactive approach that we discovered details of 3 new cases over the summer, where Raac that would have been graded as non-critical had failed without warning. The first of these was in a commercial setting. The second was in a school in a different educational jurisdiction, and in this instance, the plank that failed remained suspended, resting on a steel beam. As the plank was fully intact, the DfE engineers were able to investigate the situation. In their professional judgment, the panel affected would have been previously rated as non-critical, but it had failed. Ministerial colleagues and I were already extremely concerned. Then a third failure of Raac panels occurred at a school in England in late August. This was a panel that had been previously graded as non-critical. Because children's safety is our absolute priority, and it was right to make the difficult decision to change our guidance for education settings so that areas previously deemed to contain non-critical Raac are now being closed. Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to set out why we are taking this more cautious approach with the education estate in England. Professional guidance is clear that wherever Raac is found, it needs to be monitored closely. The school estate is very disparate, with 22,000 settings with over 64,000 individual blocks. Monitoring Raac closely is therefore very difficult to do in this estate, and many responsible bodies do not have dedicated estates professionals or on school or colleges at all times. That is why we are taking an approach that is the right one for our schools and colleges. My officials have worked closely with experts in this field. Chris Goodyear, Professor of Construction Engineering and Materials at Loughborough University, has said that the DfE has been employing some of the best engineers on this and have consulted us and the Institution of Structural Engineers. The government's priority is for every child across the UK to go to school safely. My officials have been engaging urgently with the devolved administrations to discuss our findings and offer to support to understand Raac in school estates in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Last week I wrote to offer my support, including further official or ministerial level engagement, and to facilitate discussions between our technical experts. I'm aware that this policy change occurred during recess, and therefore I was not able to notify the House in advance. For that I apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I hope you understand why I felt I had to take the decision when I did. We are taking an extremely cautious approach to this issue, but I believe that this is the right thing to do when it comes to the safety of children. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State, Bridget Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. I will turn in a moment to the sorry state of how we got here, but I would ask the House, first of all, to reflect on 2 things. Firstly, that the safety of our children and staff in schools today should be our highest priority. And while the voices of children are rarely heard in this place, it is their welfare, their hopes, their fears, which should be uppermost in our minds today. And secondly, that the mark and measure of each of us as politicians is our willingness to take and to accept responsibility. Collective responsibility, not just for our own actions, but those of the governments in which we serve. And this week, as the school year begins, there is an awful lot of responsibility for ministers to take. What an utter shambles. The defining image of 13 years of Conservative government. Children cowering under steel props to stop the ceiling falling in on their heads. 13 years into a Conservative government, and the public realm is literally crumbling around the next generation. The Education Secretary said this morning that, in her view, it is not the job of her department to ensure the safety of our children's schools, that she was doing a good job. Schools are literally at risk of collapse. She is the Education Secretary. Whose responsibility does she think it is then? Yeah. This is the tragic endgame of the sticking plaster politics of the last 13 years, and children have been failed by this Conservative government. And it is Raac which is our focus today. But the issue is wider and deeper, across our schools and across our country. Deeper because school buildings are only part of the wider failure in our education system, over which ministers have been presiding for 13 long years. Wider because thousands upon thousands of schools and other public buildings were built in the last century, not intended to last for more than a couple of decades. System build, quick, cheap, too often also made with asbestos, and not expected to still be there in 30 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is why the last Labour government took responsibility and began rebuilding them the length and breadth of our country. That is why we launched the Building Schools for the Future programme, to give our children the start they deserve. That's because then, as now, as always, Labour puts children first. The Schools Minister today was the same Schools Minister who scrapped Labour's plans as one of his very first acts back in 2010. In 2010, the Conservatives scaled back plans to just 150 school rebuilding projects each year, slowing the pace of renewal. In 2021, when the then Chancellor, now Prime Minister, delivered a spending review, he cut the pace again to just 50 a year. And today, the previous Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education told of the department's bid to double the schools rebuilding programme in 2021, knocked back by the then Chancellor, who instead of doubling it, almost halved it. Now, I spoke earlier of responsibility, and the Secretary of State was clear just a few hours ago that she refuses to accept any responsibility. So who on the government benches today? Who will take responsibility for decision after decision to slash spending on school safety? And while I thank the Secretary of State for having addressed some of the questions which families across this country will have, I'm afraid there are many, many more. Now, time is short, Madam Deputy Speaker, so I'll ask many of them in writing. But I hope she'll be able to answer these questions, to answer all of these questions, and to answer them in full. Why is she still refusing to publish the list of schools affected promptly in full today? Why did the Condition Data Collection Survey between 2017 and 2019 not look in more detail at these issues? What strategy does the Department have right now for the wider condition of system-built schools and other educational premises long past their design lifespan? How many other educational settings are currently believed or suspected by the Department to contain Raac, but that it is yet to be confirmed? Do emergency services have the information they need should something go wrong? What is the estimated timeline for completing the necessary repairs in affected schools? How long will students face disruption during this process? Which capital budgets are being raided and which priorities downgraded today to fund the works that are happening now? And what assessment has been made of the risks of a Raac failure in the context where asbestos is also present? And while there are many more questions I could ask, the most important: who in this government, in the months ahead, will take some responsibility for sorting out the chaos our children face?
Well, thank the Honourable Lady, and of course that is me. What matters is what you do. When I was given new information and had to consider the impacts that this would have on our schools and children, I took action, even though it was politically difficult. Yesterday, when the Honourable Lady was asked about Wales and Raac, she waved away concerns and said there was no problem. Why? Because it's a Labour government with Labour policies. Today, 2 schools closed in Wales just as they start their surveying programme, a surveying programme that we started in March 2022. One is taking decisions and being honest with the public. One is trying to score political points. I answered the lady's question. They will be, the information will be provided this week.
Order. That's enough. Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I answered the lady's question, the honourable lady's question. The information will be published this week, and everything will be fully funded, both the mitigation, any revenue that is required on a case-by-case basis, and also the rebuilding of the schools. In terms of doing a good job, I make no apologies for praising the work of the Department of Education. Not my work, no, but the work of colleagues, of schools, of professionals, who have helped to ensure that we're not sending children back to schools without the guarantee that they'll be safe. I've had teams working for weeks and all weekend to get porta cabins, to find alternative sites, to help put in place urgent mitigations. These people are doing a brilliant job, and I want to say my thanks to them, each and every one of them.
Dame Maria Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And my right honourable friend is absolutely right to put the safety of children first and to be very cautious about the approach she's taking. But I know from speaking to head teachers in my own constituency in Basingstoke that her department has been speaking to schools not just for weeks or months, but for years about Raac in their schools and how to mitigate that. And one of my schools in Cranbourne in Basingstoke has already got a plan in place with her department on how that problem is going to be resolved. But the new technical guidance has thrown up 2 suspected cases of Raac in my constituency. Could my honourable friend outline for parents how quickly those suspicions will either be confirmed or negated, so the schools can continue to fully function in the future?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend and also her local authority and her responsible bodies for responding to the questionnaire. 95% have done so, but that's why I'm really worried about the 5% that haven't. Those that have suspected cases, we will be surveying in the next 2 weeks, in the next few weeks, but we'll get to them probably in the next 2 weeks. But at that point, most of those that are surveyed actually don't go on to have Raac. About 2/3 of them go on to not have Raac. But we want to know exactly where it is, and then we want to make sure that we mitigate completely all of those cases.
Carol Monaghan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. Obviously, the safety of children is paramount and actions have to be taken urgently to resolve this situation. The Chancellor said yesterday we will spend whatever it takes to sort out this problem. Yet Treasury sources have admitted that there will be no new money to pay for the remedial work, with the cash instead coming out of the Department for Education's existing capital budget. So maybe she could give us some clarity on that. And given that the existing budgets are already extremely stretched, what discussions is she having with Treasury colleagues to access additional funding? She's mentioned the devolved administrations, and clearly this is something that is affecting buildings across the UK. The Scottish Government's budget has already been cut, so can she confirm that there's going to be additional funding for the devolved administrations to carry out the remedial work that will have to take place in these jurisdictions? The Sunday Mirror has reported that up to 7,000 schools could be at risk but have yet to be assessed. And a National Audit Office report in June found that 38% of English school buildings had passed their recommended Raac lifespan. This means that there are around 700,000 children in England being taught in schools that require major rebuilding. Now, she's mentioned the questionnaire that's been sent out to 22,000 schools. Can she give some clarity about the responders? What expertise do they have in order to make the assessments that she is referring to? It would be good to know, given the figures I've just quoted, the number of schools affected in the hundreds seems unrealistic. So can we get a more realistic figure of the number of schools that are likely to need work done to them? And finally, can she guarantee that children in schools that have not been closed are absolutely safe to return to lessons?
Hear, hear.
Thank the Honourable Lady. And I do notice, I don't know whether we can believe everything we read in the press, but I do read in the press that Scotland are not planning to close schools with Raac in concrete, which I think is a bit worrying, and we will continue to share technical information with our counterparts, and we have offered offered meetings of that. When you get new information and new evidence, you need to sometimes take a new approach. That's the decision that I took very recently, and it's a decision that I think is the right decision, and I would be very happy to work with her and her colleagues to share more information. Every year we get capital budgets, and we are investing significantly in our schools. Overall, the capital budget in the 2021 spending review is £19 billion, of which £7 billion is allocated to 23-24. But clearly, when we come to the next phase, which is looking at the rebuilding of our schools, we have some allocations to rebuild some of our schools, but we will also be looking at in detail of what more will be required then.
Priti Patel.
Speaker, the Secretary of State will know that St Andrew's Primary School in Hatfield-Peveril is now closed, and other schools in my constituency, including 2 large secondary schools, are experiencing partial closures. They've got mitigations in place and there's a lot of work underway. I hope she will join me in thanking Essex County Council in particular for the extraordinary leadership that they have shown on this and the way that they're working with schools. And I'd like to put on my record my thanks to the noble Baroness Barrow, who has been supporting us Essex MPs and families on this. But I have specific questions to ask, because promises have so far been made on capital costs, but will there be support for revenue impacts, particularly travel impacts, switching to remote, and in particular children that have special educational needs? Our county has a very high level of SEND pupils, and we need to understand that. Madam Deputy Speaker, if I may as well, caseworkers have been mentioned. We need to know whether or not these caseworkers are actually going to engage with MPs, because my experience to date is that they're not prepared to speak to MPs about what is going on in schools. And can I finally ask, what's the role of Ofsted in this? I mean, will they account for disruption caused by these issues if they're going to be looking at schools? And also the impact this is going to have on school exams, particularly those children that are being examined this year.
I thank my honourable friend and my right honourable friend, and I would very much join her in praising Essex County Council. There's a lot of cases in Essex. There is a concentration. They have done an amazing job. They have really answered all the questionnaires in great detail and are very much gripping the issue, and we're working very closely together. In terms of revenue, we have said that we will, on a case-by-case basis, if a school will come to the department and tell us what revenue there is, then we will make sure that they have the support that they need. Caseworkers currently are focused on working with the schools. It's very early in this process. We're mitigating a lot of the work, and not everybody is as far ahead as some of the schools that she referred to. What we have done is opened a hotline, a helpline for members of Parliament. We had that, we extended the hours so it was open the weekend, because I know some people got their dear colleague and didn't notice it until the helpline had closed, so we had it open the weekend. It will be open all through the week as well. They will be getting the same information from the caseworker system, and that's how it will work. Sorry.
Ben Bradshaw.
When the Prime Minister, as Chancellor, slashed the school's repair budget, despite being warned of the danger to children, how big a factor in that decision was the fact that neither he nor most of the Conservative cabinet actually used state schools for their own children?
Well, it's simply not correct that the size of the school rebuilding programme has been cut in recent years. It's currently at the same scale as it was announced in 2020. This is roughly in line with the scale of rebuilding projects being delivered per year since the start of the previous programme. So it's the scale of the rebuilding projects, if you want to listen, being delivered per year since the start of the previous programme. It's the same. So the priority school building programme, it will continue, and we will continue to fund the schools.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you for calling a state-educated Conservative member, Speaker. May I, through the Secretary of State, thank Baroness Barron, who reached out immediately to me, together with a highly competent senior official, when this problem arose in one of my schools this March, Not only did they do that, but they also seized the opportunity to encourage a resending of the questionnaire to the network of schools through the contact that I had had with one of my own head teachers. I have rarely, in 26 years in this House, seen a department so proactive on an issue as they were on this one, and I thank them for it.
Well, I thank my honourable friend from one state-educated person to another. It is true we have taken action quickly, but Baroness Barron in particular has been working on this since way before I was in the department and has done an amazing job. So thank you for recognising that. She has really pushed us to make sure that we get additional information, we get the evidence, and we have all of those surveys back. So we know, unlike most other places, where Raac is in our schools. So when I was tasked with the new evidence, I could identify exactly which schools were impacted immediately because of all the work that she had done.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we've heard already that the capital budgets for this year are going to be raided to pay for the government's failure and incompetence over the last 13 years in maintaining and rebuilding our schools, can the Minister just explain to me what will happen to schools like Hall Road in my own constituency, desperately in need of a rebuild? Will it actually get the rebuild now? And if, just finally, if the Minister's really short of cash in her department, perhaps one option might be to bring in a swear box to raise a few bob.
I thank the honourable lady for her joke, but as a Scouser I have a bit of a higher bar, I think. But it's not, in addition to our targeted work on Raac, we have continued to invest in improving the condition of the school estate with over 15 billion allocated since 2015, including 1.8 billion committed for 23-24. That's informed by the consistent data on the condition of the estate. By the way, the Labour programme, which was absolutely scathing reports about it, didn't even look at the condition. It was not a factor or a criteria. On top of this, we will transform 500 schools through our school rebuilding programme. So we will still be continuing with the school rebuilding programme, prioritising those buildings in the poorest conditions and those with evidence of safety issues.
John Redwood.
Will individual schools have direct access to the money and to the temporary accommodation if they need it? And will every local education authority make an urgent statement about their role in commissioning the schools in the first place and in maintenance where they are responsible?
I thank the honourable gentleman. And the reason we have put a caseworker in place is so that each school can work with a caseworker and to make sure they get access to a temporary accommodation that we have already secured, and also the company that can do the prop-in, which we've already secured, or if there's additional surveying required as well. And in terms of the local authorities, we're working very closely with the local authorities, but what I would like to take this opportunity to do is to urge those 5% who have not responded to the questionnaire to please respond to the questionnaire. It's more important than it ever was.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for her statement, but would urge her to do two things. First, to impress on the Prime Minister that this is a national scale problem which will reach across all departments, as we know that there are other public buildings that will have been affected. She mentioned putting children's safety first, and I'm sure we all agree with her. And in her discussions with the devolved authorities, could she impress upon the Scottish Government the need for urgency? Because, as she mentioned, they are still saying as of today that the buildings are safe. Now, there are 2 primary schools that have been named in my constituency, and I am concerned that perhaps they are not acting with the same urgency that is necessary.
I thank the honourable lady for a question. There are 2 ways of going about this. The first is to go through the responsible bodies, and that, to be fair, is what we were doing until 2019, but then we didn't think that we were being quick enough. We didn't have a good enough picture of where Raac was and what state it was in. That's why we started the direct questionnaire and surveying programme, which has enabled us to have all this data so that we could take quick action when we got new evidence over the summer. We'll be sharing that very closely. It is new evidence, and we'll be sharing that with, continue to share that with the devolved administrations. But I believe that sometimes it's right to take direct approach. It's not a typical thing that a government department in Whitehall does, but sometimes it is the correct thing to do, and that's what we've done, and I think that will put us in good stead for being decisive about keeping people safe.
Vicky Ford.
Deputy Speaker, the 3 schools known to have Raac in my constituency have all opened safely to all students this week. And can I particularly thank the head teacher and team at Springfield Primary School. They had to close their year 5 and 6 classrooms last term. The students were immediately, within a week, found accommodation in other schools. All the building work has been completed over the summer, and the prefabs that had been ordered just in case are now being released to other schools. It is right that children's safety comes first. But it is also right that we're mindful of the language that we use towards children and don't make them more frightened than they need to be. And I would encourage colleagues not to over-exaggerate or generalise these risks, but to work with each affected school calmly to get this resolved for children.
I thank my honourable friend, and she's absolutely right. This is a proactive thing that we're doing. We have the information, we have the skills and the people who are going to support us. What's most important is that we minimise the disruption to children. In most cases, as the honourable lady points out in her own constituency, there is minimal impact, but we have to make sure that we work together to make sure children are back in school as soon as possible.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I was a teacher in a secondary school when their building schools for the funding was cut by the Conservative-led government in 2010. Has the Department of Education carried out an assessment comparing schools that had their BSF funding cut with those that have Raac concrete?
Yes, I have, in fact, and it wasn't very many, because there's 2 things that you need to know about the Better School Future. The first was it wasn't based on condition, and the second is it didn't include a single primary school. Now, a lot of the schools that we've identified, 156, are primary schools. In terms of the building schools for the future, and I wasn't involved then, but I have looked in great detail of it, because I remember it growing up in Knowsley. The schools that were built that didn't contain a single classroom wall, known locally as the wacky warehouses, cost a fortune, cost millions to put right afterwards. And the James Review is something I would point the honourable lady to, because that is pretty scathing about a programme that was bureaucratic, failed to deliver. I think it delivered 180 schools, wasn't built on condition, and built wacky warehouses in Knowsley.
Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Deputy Speaker, as the MP with 8 identified schools with Raac issues and 2 others under investigation, more than I think in any other constituency, can I thank her for her exemplary statement, which was perfectly rational and demonstrates that she personally has certainly taken her responsibilities despite the political dangers she's put herself into. But can I just ask about the caseworkers? Does that mean there's 1 caseworker for each school, or how many schools is each caseworker having to deal with? And it would be helpful if we could contact the caseworkers, as my right honourable friend for Whittam said. And finally, can I just ask, the schools that have already closed, the buildings that are closed, Mistley Norman in my constituency, for example, was closed in July, and she will know that I had a meeting with Baroness Barron about this in July, so we've been working on this long before this blew up last week. Will the capital funding be made available to rebuild Mistley Norman School?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's right, he has a lot of impacted schools in his area. In terms of the capital funding, I think the Chancellor was very clear that we will do whatever we need to keep children safe. We will be looking, there's 3 stages. The first is the funding to make sure we put all the mitigations in place. The second is to look at revenue funding if that's required on an ongoing basis. And then the third is the rebuilding programmes. In terms of the caseworkers, there's just over 50 caseworkers. So they're dealing with 2 schools each, more or less. In terms of access to the caseworkers, as I said, right now they're focusing on the schools, and the helpline is supposed to have access to the same information. But I see that perhaps we will look for some specific approach for Essex MPs so that we can go through in detail with some of the caseworkers. I think that could be helpful.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. After Grenfell, many of us raised concerns about the risks to other buildings for other materials. That fell on deaf ears. The Prime Minister this morning said that some 900 schools could be affected. There were warnings many years ago to the government, and they fell on deaf ears. Can the Secretary of State explain to the British people, parents who are rightly concerned about whether their schools and their kids could be affected, that their children are going to be safe, and she is going to put the support and resources that are needed urgently to respond to this crisis that is made in the hands of her government because of negligence and incompetence?
Well, the Honourable Lady possibly needs to know that the Labour Party were also warned in 1999, 2002 and 2007. And what did they do? Nothing, not a single survey. Yesterday, the Honourable Lady, my shadow Secretary of State, dismissed concerns about Raac in Wales because it was following her government's policies. As soon as we had the collapse of the school in 2018, we issued a warning to all responsible bodies, and that they were the ones responsible. We also issued guidance of how to identify Raac, and in answer to the Honourable Lady's questions, to use a structured engineer to do that. And then we also thought we needed to go further, which is why we are probably the only country in the world that has a good understanding of where Raac is in all of their schools.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is obviously a very serious issue, but can I just say that when I was talking to the Chief Executive of a large multi-academy trust over the weekend, or at the end of last week and over the weekend, he said the government had absolutely made the right decision in the guidance that they have given. Now, we, as we've heard, are particularly affected in Essex. I think about half the schools are in Essex. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe you are very concerned about 6 schools within your own constituency. And while we are working through these, one of the issues that has been raised with me is this ongoing issue of funding. I know you've already addressed it. I know the Secretary of State has already addressed this. But can she again confirm from the dispatch box that any additional revenue costs, reasonable revenue costs, will be met, so that budgetary concerns will not be a barrier to delivering face-to-face education that our children so richly deserve?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I'm glad he used the word reasonable as well, because the reason we've asked for the revenue to come on an individual basis is they will all differ, and obviously we need to make sure that it's reasonable and it's put in place. But we will certainly support any school with additional funding as is required. And I think due to the fact, as the honourable gentleman mentioned, almost half the cases are in Essex. I think it probably warrants setting up a working group with the Essex MPs so that we can work through in great detail.
Excellent. Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I believe Birmingham is quite badly affected if the Secretary of State would like to come and hang out with us. I have a number of schools in my constituency that have it confirmed, and also some that are suspected. One particular concern of the head teachers is that they are this week expecting Ofsted to come in, having over the weekend had to completely redo all of their timetables, change all of their teaching arrangements over the weekend. So I wonder if the Secretary of State could give some assurances that that won't be allowed to happen, where that is the case in any of these schools. Also, with regards to timing of this particular issue, the Secretary of State said earlier that she had teams of working weeks on procuring porta cabins, which suggests that she knew before the 31st of August that more schools would need to close all or part of their building. So can she explain why she had people procuring porta cabins for weeks?
Yeah. Yes, I can very happily, because she might work out that I do know the details of this in great detail. The porta cabins that we were procuring for weeks are for the 56 buildings that we had already identified with Raac that were critical. So those we immediately took out of use. So we have that need for those 52, actually. 52. The 104, which were non-critical, are now deemed critical because of this new evidence, so we will continue to do that. What we've done is contacted more suppliers already, and we have got that in place because we don't want to have a delay there. I'm always happy to visit the Honourable Lady in Birmingham, and in terms of the particular case for Ofsted, if she wants to give me the details, we will see if it's appropriate and if we could delay it. If they do usually delay if there's some specific issues within a school, so we can raise that with them.
Anna Firth.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Putting the safety of children first is obviously right, but the Secretary of State will know that Kingsdown School, in my constituency in Southend, a special school, houses some of the most vulnerable children in Southend and indeed the South East, and is currently closed due to Raac. The headmistress, Louise Robinson, and the new cabinet portfolio holder, Helen Boyd, at Southend City Council have been brilliant working round the clock. And I thank the schools minister too for his support last week. But they do need three things. They need the results of a risk assessment, they need some demountable classrooms, and they need some structural remediation measures. So will the Secretary of State please write and tell us exactly when those will materialise?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I'm very happy to, and I know that Kingsdown was one of the first identified, and obviously has additional special needs as well. So I know that there's the caseworker is looking into that, and also in terms of just so it's clear why we made the decision not to publish all the names initially. Kingsdown actually, it was published, I think, by the council, and it was inundated by media, which made it incredibly difficult for them. And they asked for our help in making sure that they didn't have too much media distraction. So we really needed to be conscious of that as well.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Department for Education itself assessed in 2020 that it needed around $7 billion a year for capital funding for schools. The department bid, after some negotiation, for £4 billion in the spending review 2020, but was only allocated £3.1 billion. This is after over a decade of underinvestment in capital and maintenance in school buildings. So can't the Secretary of State acknowledge that some of these things are chickens coming home to roost?
Secretary of
Well,
State.
as I said in answer to a question before to the another honourable lady, we're investing significantly in our schools, and the overall capital budget in 2021 spending review is £19 billion, of which £7 billion is allocated to the year 23-24.
Mark François.
Thank you, Mark. I commend the work of Baroness Barron and of County Councillor Tony Ball and all his team at Essex County Council, who've worked their socks off ultimately to keep children safe. But I regret to tell the Secretary of State that, having now managed to actually speak to all of the heads of affected schools in my constituency, there are a number of differences between what I've been told by her department and, if you like, the ground truth that I've been told by the head teachers themselves. For instance, Hockley Primary, back in July I was promised 8 relocatable classrooms ready to go by today. They now won't be available till mid-November. So when this list is published later this week, can the Secretary of State please ensure that the information in it is absolutely accurate, absolutely up to date, because that is the best way to reassure parents, staff and pupils, not least those parents who will be very upset if they hear with virtually no notice they have to take weeks off work because their children cannot go to school.
Well, my honourable friend raises one of the challenges that we face. So in the case of Hockley, soft ground has meant that we have to put footings in place before we can put the temporary accommodation, and each site is different to some degree. So, and this was one of the reasons we were trying to make sure that we took some time to get some mitigations in place, and we could put those by school, because it is difficult, because each one of those schools could have some specific circumstances. So I'm afraid the list and the information will evolve over time as we get more and more details, and the caseworkers will keep us up to date with that.
Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I think today the Secretary of State has proven the value of having media studies on the curriculum. But on the serious point, I've been notified by both my local education authorities, Tameside and Stockport, that no schools under their control are affected. But what they can't tell me is whether any of the voluntary aided academies or free schools within their areas are affected. So I would like to know how soon we will get those assurances. And also in respect of Russell Scott Primary School in the Denton part of my constituency, which we have battled and fought to get successfully added to the government school rebuilding programme. It's got its own issues not associated with Raac. Can she assure me and the head teacher that that school won't be bumped down the programme to patch up this mess?
Secretary of State.
Well, the honourable gentleman, if he has schools impacted in his area, multi-academy trust, they will have heard directly from us, and he should have a dear colleague with the details of those, and then he can contact the helpline to get more information if he wants. Thank him for his kind comments about media studies. I think it proves that's not what I did before I became a politician. But in terms of the building and the building schools for the future, it will be based on condition and need. But of course we will work with him and his school to tell him where they are in terms of the condition and need and whether they're prioritised.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State is absolutely right to prioritise the safety of our children and to close schools where necessary. Will she now give the House an assurance that those 600 priority schools will be surveyed as quickly as possible, and then we can move on to all schools and find out where RAS is present in all schools and the appropriate remediations taken for every school that's got it?
Secretary of State.
Yes, and I'd like to assure my honourable friend that it is already below that number because we have been surveying every day and we have contracted now 8 building surveying companies. We did have 3, we now have 8 to make sure that we have sufficient capacity to do that as quickly as possible. All the ones that are suspected, and as I said, most of them will not probably go on to be confirmed to have Raac, but the ones that are suspected, we will be doing a survey and we hope to get through them all in the next couple of weeks.
Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As one of the ministers who came into the DFE back in 2010, contrary to some of the claims being made by the opposition front bench, building schools for the future we found was hugely expensive, hugely bureaucratic, involving elaborate quangos, with most of the money being spent before a single brick had actually been laid, mostly built with PFI funding, saddling schools with interest payments for 30 years. How many of these schools may have been PFI funded, and who will pick up the remedial work bill for them?
Secretary of State.
The honourable gentleman reminds us all of the other legacy of the Building the Schools programme of the future, which was the PFI that probably they're still paying for today. The department has taken a different approach, and it's reduced costs by simplifying the design and construction, more standardisation of a design, economies of scale by offering central procurement, and we have reduced the cost significantly of each school. In terms of PFI, I will have to respond, get back to the honourable gentleman, because I don't know how many of these, if any, have any remaining PFI. Certainly not under our watch.
Lynn Brown.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, in Newham we have 8,363 children in temporary accommodation thanks to the government's housing policies. Shocking. That's more homeless children in one borough than in 3 whole English regions combined. At the moment, we have 1 primary school confirmed with Raac and several others, including a very large secondary school, still in limbo. School closures may therefore be a problem for thousands of children who, as with COVID, will not have access to remote learning. Can I at least be assured today that this time this government will prioritise children without access, provide particular and individual resources to support their education so that they don't endure yet another blight on their life chances due to the continuing incompetence of this government?
Well, I'd like to assure the Honourable Lady that this is nothing like COVID. This is actually going to be much quicker, and we will reduce the impact on face-to-face learning as much as possible. And of course, we will prioritise getting children back and making sure that they are in school. In terms of Newham, I'm sure the Honourable Lady is absolutely delighted because due to the reforms of the Conservative government, it is now one of the best performing areas in the country.
Jack Burton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm not aware of any Raac schools in Stoke-on-Trent, but we do have a number of schools with wider serious structural and safety issues, particularly Trentham Academy in my constituency, which we hope to be included in the school rebuilding programme, but was stopped because of the PFI agreement. So will my right honourable friend ensure that, just as with all the Raac schools, that we assess schools for wider structural and safety issues, and that we also look at how we can ensure that schools that are part of PFI agreements, that they can have those issues addressed as well?
I know my honourable friend has raised this school before, and I know that has had a couple of meetings on this particular school. And of course, the school rebuilding programme is focused on condition, and we will specifically work with him to understand what options there are in terms of that school and what PFI is doing to stop its eligibility for rebuilding.
Maiden question. Sarah Dyke.
Madam Deputy Speaker, children in Somerset have gone back to school and are going back to school this week in buildings which may collapse at any moment. At least 3 schools in Somerset and Frome may have this week concrete. Will the Education Secretary apologise for all the stress that this government has caused families because they have slashed repair bills and sat on their hands for months?
Secretary of State.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her maiden question. It is a little ill-informed, but what I will make sure happens is that the schools in Somerton and Frome, if they're identified, then you will have a dear colleague, and I'll just check that's happened because I know the Honourable Lady is new to the House. You will also, if they're suspected, as long as your local authorities or multi-academy trusts have responded, if they're suspected, then we'll be coming to do the surveys as soon as possible, and then we will have mitigation actions in place to make sure that there's minimum disruption to children in Somerton and Frome.
Maggie Throop.
To reassure Eros residents, will my right honourable friend reconfirm her commitment to the school rebuilding programme, specifically the 2 recently approved projects at Kirkhallam Community Academy and St John Norton Catholic Voluntary Academy in my constituency? And can she reassure me that the timetable for these rebuilds will be unaffected by the need to carry out the repairs to school buildings found to contain Raac?
I thank my honourable friend for her question. I think probably I'd better get the names of the schools and check the detail, but I believe that they will still be going ahead if they've already been approved. But if my honourable friend could give me the details, I'll make sure that I get an answer to her quickly.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chair of the Public Accounts Committee rightly drew attention to the National Audit Office report, which highlighted the serious underfunding of the capital programme in the Department for Education, which is the real cause of these problems. That report also said the DfE currently lacks comprehensive information on the extent and severity of potential safety issues across the school estate. That's a damning indictment. The Secretary of State cannot stand up in this House today and say that our children are safe because she does not know whether any more systemic failures of schools presenting safety problems is going to occur.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. And we've done 3 building and conditions survey, plus we've had the Raac surveying and questionnaire programme. So we know a lot more than anybody has ever known, including everybody on the benches opposite.
Alberto Costa.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it seems that the risk of Raac being present in 2 of my South Leicestershire schools is very low, but it's not been as yet ruled out. Would my right honourable friend please confirm that she and her team working in the Department for Education will work as fast as is reasonably possible to ensure that the schools affected are given the information that they need to inform parents?
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable gentleman. I'm not sure the status of the two schools. If their questionnaires have been provided and they're on the suspected Raac list, then there will be surveyors going in the next couple of weeks. And at that point, if it is identified with Raac, then we will immediately take the action similar to what we've done today or last week with the 104, and parents will be informed immediately if that action has to be taken. But as I said earlier, 2/3 of schools that are suspected do not turn out to have Raac.
Afsana Begum.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Seven Mills Primary School in my constituency was found to have Raac following an inspection earlier in the year. They're a small school and they have had to close their main hall, which is their biggest space. I visited the school last Friday and saw for myself the logistical challenges that the school leadership have had to overcome at such short notice to ensure that they can deliver teaching, school lunches and physical education from other spaces. Now, whilst this school is not among the most severely impacted by Raac, I am concerned that schools in this category that at present are able to remain open will be left behind in capital works and in receiving the associated DFE funding and support for these works. Every school impacted by Raac needs to be remedied as quickly as possible. So what reassurances and assurances can the Secretary of State provide that schools that are currently able to remain open will not have to endure disruption for a longer period of time because they may be deemed a lower priority?
Well, it is our intention that all of the schools remain open as much as possible, and we expect most of them will. And I'd like to thank the head teacher and all the staff at her school because they've worked very quickly and they've really done a lot to make sure they move things around within the school system so that they can keep children learning, and they've been a bit flexible. In terms of disruption, if there's disruption that is either incurring costs or they wish to access a temporary accommodation or other costs, then they can talk to the Department for Education and see if they are eligible for that programme.
Order. We have a problem on time here this afternoon because we have a great deal of business to get through later today, and I'm aware that more than 30 people are still trying to catch my eye to ask a question. Normally, I would allow a statement to run for an hour. I will not curtail this statement after an hour because I appreciate that every member who is here has a specific problem to bring to the Secretary of State. But I would ask, please, for short questions, and that will then allow the Secretary of State to give short answers. We've done all the political bits, so we don't need any more of that. Just the questions and the answers, please. Ian Liddell-Granger.
I will be short. Multi-academy trusts, I'm not getting in touch with MPs. Secretary of State, could you please make sure they do? I have two that are not in my constituency. Which brings me another problem. The Minister of State is aware that Haygrove School in my constituency is a brand new building, which is now being condemned, basically. The problem is, people think it's the cement. This building is 2 years old. I'm afraid, Secretary of State, decisions need to be made now about the building to be redone as soon as possible.
Secretary of State.
Thank my honourable friend. He should have the details of schools in his constituency and a dear colleague, and he can phone the helpline and get information on those schools. But in addition to that, I'm sure the schools would appreciate my honourable friend getting in touch. If there's any difficulty with that, I'll be very happy, or my honourable friend, the schools minister, will be very happy to help him.
Justin Murders.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One positive from this farce is that we should see no more lectures from members opposite about us not fixing the roof when the sun was shining. But what I want to ask is how detailed and accurate is this list going to be when the Secretary of State produces it? I say that because on Friday night she emailed me saying there were no schools in my constituency affected. There was one that may be a possibility, but then on Sunday I heard from a head teacher who's had to make arrangements because Raac had been discovered in their school. So the Secretary of State is telling me that there's none in the constituency that have got a problem, but I know for a fact that information is incorrect. So can she be giving us an assurance that when this list comes out, it is going to be 100% accurate?
It's very difficult to assure 100% accuracy on a moving feast, but I will look at that case in question because we have caseworkers, a caseworker system, we've identified all the cases, and you should have the details of all the cases in your constituency on the dear colleague. If anybody hasn't got that, then please do contact myself and the schools minister and we'll check it out.
Aaron Bell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I thank the Secretary of State for coming today, giving such a measured and reasonable statement in these very trying circumstances. The timing is terrible, as she acknowledged, but it is right that we put the safety of children first. And could she confirm that the reason the timing is terrible is because new facts have come to light, and that is why we've had to make the decision we have?
100%. The new information, which came as late as towards the end of August, is what made us take a different approach. And I didn't want to do. It's the last thing I wanted to do, but it was the right thing to do.
Abina Al-Pongasari.
Thank you. It's confidently confirmed to me that every school that has been identified with Raac has been contacted by the government on what action to take.
Secretary of State.
Yes, I can confirm that those have been identified with Raac, which was two types, either those with critical condition or non-critical condition, will have had action. We actually changed the action for the non-critical. Those that may be waiting are those that are in the suspected Raac, that we will be doing surveys in the next 2 weeks. I'm not sure which, if my honourable friend or lady has a school in mind, but they could be in either one of those categories.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The information I have from the Secretary of State is that there are no confirmed cases of Raac in Stroud schools, but there are 3 schools who are taking surveys as a precautionary measure, and those surveys will be accelerated. Will my right honourable friend take this opportunity to reassure parents and schools, because sometimes if they listen to the media or to the opposition front bench, they'll think every school in the country is crumbling, which is absolutely not the case. And will she also talk to the department about making sure that head teachers get information ahead of the public and ahead of the media, because we know that hasn't happened always, and it's really important to families.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. To put into context the scale, there are 22,500 schools in the country. 156 have been confirmed with Raac. Of those that are suspected that we will be going through the survey process, probably a third or less will be confirmed with Raac. So it really is important that we put this into context. We've taken tough decisions, we've taken the right action, but the vast majority of parents, teachers and children will not be impacted by Raac in our schools.
Clive Efford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What's been exposed here is how close the government were prepared to go to a catastrophe in one of our schools before they took last-minute action just before schools went back this summer. Now, a school in my constituency has had to close substantial parts of its buildings. And in a letter from the DfE following their discussions, it says, as officials discussed with the Trust, the immediate action should be treated as short-term measure, and you should already be developing a long-term plan for the remediation of Raac panels in your building. Goes on in the next paragraph, please note that building survey in June 2023 was carried out as part of the DfE's Raac assessment programme. As such, it should be considered in addition to, rather than in place of, any professional advice that you seek. So just exactly how is the government going to determine what it's going to pay for? What work will it accept? Will it be the professional judgment of the people that the schools engage? Or will it be the surveyors that from the 8 companies that the Secretary of State has just spoken about? How will these matters be resolved going forward? Because the devil in these things is always in the detail.
Just before the Secretary of State answers the question, we're not doing very well on the short questions, are we? But of course it's up to members. It's up to colleagues. If the House decides it wants to be voting at midnight tonight, that's fine with me. But I think that it's probably not the consensus. So please, let's take some action now. And everybody look at what they've got written down and cut it in half. Secretary of State.
I can confirm that RIC's registered surveyors are acceptable.
Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State knows that in July I met with the Minister of State when St James's Primary School in my constituency was found to have Raac. The head teacher, Mr Tutt, and his staff and governors have done a heroic job in finding space for the children and having works during the summer to restore the classrooms. Will the Minister of State meet with me straight after this statement to confirm that they now pass muster so that the school can now reopen as planned?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I can confirm my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, is doing an MP meeting after this, but he can meet after that. And yes, they've done an excellent job, and I'd like to thank all the people involved in making sure they've taken the action they have. But we will, by the end of today, work with the honourable gentleman to make sure we know how it will get finalised.
Alex Cunningham.
Deputy Speaker, there are conflicting reports about William Cassidy Primary, St Michael's Secondary and Freddie Natras Primary, which the Secretary of State told me in her letter may have this dodgy concrete. She says it could take weeks to survey them, but Stockton Council say no schools in the borough are affected and all remain open. How can school leaders reassure parents and the children themselves that they're safe in school when there is such conflicting information? And who is right?
Secretary of State.
Well, there shouldn't be conflicting information, and the dear colleague letter will be right, because that school will have an assigned caseworker. But I think this is a school that you think is going to be surveyed, so it's not one that's been identified so far. Yeah, okay. I will check out on behalf of the honourable gentleman. But if they're going to be surveyed, it could be that the council may not know about it.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the face of changing evidence, the cautious approach is clearly the right one, but has been acknowledged that leads many pupils, some at Wadston School in my constituency, back into online learning rather than the face-to-face classroom learning they deserve, which equally has a knock-on impact to a small number of children when it comes to safeguarding. I've been in close contact with the head teacher, Matthew Abbott, and his team at Wadston School over the weekend and today, and so far, as of their call at 2 p.m, have not been offered direct assistance in getting temporary classrooms, but rather given the impression that they're to be left to their own devices to procure their own under usual public sector procurement rules, which are very onerous when it comes to renting things like a village hall or the Methodist church. So can my right honourable friend intervene to make sure Wadston does get that support on the temporary classrooms, and if they are left to their own devices, that the public sector procurement rules are made more lax when it comes to getting those facilities?
The reason we've deliberately spoken and worked with 3 porta-cabin or equivalent porta-cabin providers is to avoid just that problem. So if you give us the details, we'll follow up with that.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fear that the Secretary of State will rue her boasts about her good understanding as a hostage to fortune to what's going on today. Late on Friday evening, she wrote to me to say that Walthamstow School for Girls was being surveyed for suspected Raac. This was a source of deep frustration to my local authority, who, when in 2018 saw that there were problems with national incidents, spent their own money surveying every school in our borough and then paying for the remedial works. They've told the Department of Education about that, not once, not twice, but 3 times. When there's this little grip on what is going on, how can any parent, pupil or school staff member have any confidence? If the Secretary of State wants to know why people are laughing and not saying she's doing a good job, she needs to look in the mirror.
Secretary of State.
Well, I will take the honourable lady's advice and look in the mirror later. But what I would like to say is it is the responsible body's job. So if they have already gone ahead, as we issued in the warnings in 2018, we warned everybody, we told everybody what they needed to do. So I'm delighted that they got on and did that work.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, for the hotline that she set up, and I'm pleased to say that it's informed my office that there is no Raac been found in my constituency. But I do welcome the work she's done to keep children safe where it has been found. The Sir William Robertson School in my constituency doesn't have Raac, but it does have other structural issues and is in the school rebuilding programme. The Chancellor has said money will be available that is required to repair the concrete. Can she confirm that this is new money, that the rebuild of the Sir William Robertson Academy will still go ahead?
Secretary of State.
I will have to write to the honourable lady about that particular school because I don't have the list of all the school rebuilding, but that is the intention, that school rebuild, ones that have already been identified and announced will still go ahead.
Christian Waitford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I received an email from the Secretary of State at 7:15 p.m. on Friday night, the weekend before schools were due to go back, advising that a school might be affected. So the truth is that the Secretary of State just doesn't even know. So can the Secretary of State advise when parents will know whether their children are safe at school or not? Because this isn't good enough, is it?
They are safe in school. When I say if there's something that might, that means it's been identified from the questionnaire that the responsible body has brought back. It's been identified as suspected Raac. They're the ones that we will be doing the surveys in the next 2 weeks. As I say, 2/3 of them usually are not, but that sounds to me like it's a school in that category, and we'll be getting to it in the next 2 weeks.
So, Dr. Matthew Offord.
Deputy Speaker, when the issue of Raac was raised across the whole of the public estate, I asked the department what estimate it had made for the implications of its policies of the use of this material. On the 25th of July, I was told it is the responsibility of those who run schools and who work for their schools day to day to manage the safety and maintenance of their buildings. The department provides support on a case-by-case basis if it is alerted to a serious safety issue which responsible bodies cannot manage independently. So can the Secretary of State tell me, before it was raised with her, given to her attention, who was the responsible body? Was it the head teacher and the governing body? Was it the local authority? Or was it the Department for Education?
The responsible bodies are typically the local authority or the multi-academy trust. That's typically who they are. But it's fair to say that we have recently changed our approach to become more directly involved to make sure that we help schools and responsible bodies to move quickly on this issue.
Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I wanted to put on record my thanks to Hornsey School for Girls and the local authority, which do have a plan for students to return safely to school. But my question is about whether the money that was intended for the neighbouring schools, Fortismere, which is riddled with asbestos, and Highgate Wood School, which is desperate for a new sports hall, which is crumbling and Dickensian, will the money that was intended for them be used for Hornsey School for Girls? Is one part of the budget just going to be raided so that it can prop up a failing government, a failing education service and a failing education department?
Well, I don't agree with the last couple of comments, but if the school has been already confirmed for the school rebuilding programme, then it will continue.
Rob Roberts.
Madam Deputy Speaker, education is of course devolved in Wales, but as the Secretary of State has rightly said, this isn't a time for political point scoring, nor is it really a time for jurisdictional squabbling. Can she confirm that any remedial funding that is required to repair these buildings should the situation arise in Wales, given that this predates devolution by several decades, will still be provided by the UK government?
I think the Welsh Government will be providing the response to Raac in Wales and also the funding for Raac in Wales.
Hal Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Honourable Gentleman has now said, the schools that are suffering from Raac were built before devolution, before the advent of the Welsh Government, and indeed have been inspected properly by the local authority. Now, she has said, and I quote, "I stand ready to support you," to the Welsh Education Minister, yet the Chancellor said that there is no new money. Might not the people of Wales and the people of Holyhead and Mynne Bridge in particular view her words as an empty political gesture?
Secretary of State.
Well, I think the Honourable Gentleman knows that education is devolved in Wales.
Sir Jake Berry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State has said on several occasions that her and her department are prioritising pupils still accessing face-to-face learning. As that's the case, on Thursday when she publishes her definitive list, will she also publish an estimate of the number of pupils who aren't able to access face-to-face learning, and will she commit to the House that she will update this on an ongoing basis?
I cannot promise the Honourable Gentleman that that will be in the publication this week. That is more likely to be the schools and the mitigations in place, but then we will put together the information which says pupils face-to-face and remote learning, and we will update that regularly.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State will know that people go into teaching because they have a passion for educating young people and giving them a brighter future. They do not go into teaching to become building managers. And given that over the last 13 years we've seen lots of caretakers and school building managers cut because of school budget cuts, what confidence does she have that the information that she is getting from these questionnaires is accurate?
Secretary of State.
The responsible body is responding to the questionnaire, so not the schools. As the Honourable Lady says, the school teachers are there to teach the children, but the responsible body will be responsible for filling in the questionnaires.
Philip Hollowbone.
The Secretary of State's commitment to publish the list of impacted schools as soon as possible.
she's urging responsible bodies who haven't responded to the questionnaires, and she said there were 5% who had not done so, to fill in the questionnaire and return it. Could we not make it a statutory requirement for responsible bodies to return those questionnaires? And will she think about publishing a list of those responsible bodies which have not done so?
Yes. I thank the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, for his question. What we've done is we've written to them again. My colleague Baroness Barron has written to them again and requested that they respond to their questionnaires by the end of the week. We will then need to consider what we do with those that are still awaiting.
Leila Moran.
Madam Deputy Speaker, speaking with Chief Executive of a local trust earlier today, their top priority is how they are going to fund this, and I was worried to hear the words reasonable costs come from the Secretary of State just now. Can she confirm that a list of what is considered reasonable cost will be published as soon as possible? And would that include, for example, heating? Because clearly heating a porta cabin over winter is going to be much more costly than heating a well-insulated classroom.
Secretary of State.
Well, actually, the porta cabins of today are actually very well insulated. What I would advise the Honourable Lady is any particular case, if they could refer that to the department, the school can come directly to the department with their revenue requests, and then we will look at it individually on each basis.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year it was announced that Wales High School, one of the largest secondary schools in Rother Valley, was up as part of the school rebuilding programme, a tens of £1 million investment in my school to try and have better conditions for my children. Does she agree with me that it's this government that's investing in rebuilding our schools so all of our children across the country have a better standard of education?
Yes, I absolutely agree. The school rebuilding programme that we have is much more efficient, much cheaper, comes complete with classroom walls, and is definitely much quicker to build as well.
Karen Buck.
Speaker, how many of the schools affected are academy schools? Are any free schools or standalone academies? And of those schools that are not directly accountable to the Department of Education, what support is the government given to local authorities and diocesan authorities? Because it is in cases like the school affected in my constituency, it is the Church of England that is on the front line, and they need extra help as well.
And the Church of England are a responsible body for some of the schools as well. They're schools which were built between 1950 and the mid-90s, so it's any schools that were built within that period of time, and the responsible bodies will work with all the responsible bodies.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an obvious call that if an expert in concrete is advising some building might collapse, to say that children shouldn't be being taught in it. So the Secretary of State was absolutely right to do what she did last week on that decision. Where the issue comes is ensuring timely and accurate information for local authorities and local representatives. So how does she propose to make sure that local councils and local diocesan boards of education are kept fully updated, particularly as results of surveys come forward?
Secretary of State.
Yes, we intend to publish management information. So as I say, the list will be published this week, which will have the initial information about mitigations, and then we will publish more management information probably from the following week, and then we'll regularly update it as cases move on and move off.
Thank you. Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. St James's RC Primary School in my constituency had critical Raac identified in June. Despite what the Secretary of State told the media this morning, this has not been immediately fixed and the school is now closed. Ministers and the DfE guidance has been contradictory on funding temporary costs, and the school has been told to fund travel and temporary arrangements themselves. This is not acceptable. Can the Secretary of State confirm a timetable for works to make schools safe and that all costs will be fully funded? And finally, can the Secretary of State make clear, the Secretary of State made clear earlier today that she does not consider this situation to be her fault or her responsibility. So maybe she can tell us who she thinks has been sat on their asses.
Well, I think, as I made the point to the journalist earlier, I made an off-the-cuff remark at the end of an interview which was already finished. But in terms of what I was responding to, effectively the journalist had given me an interview which made everything my fault. You know, everything in 1994 was my fault when I was working somewhere else, everywhere I was working. So I pointed out to the journalist that off the cuff, that's that's what I said. And no, not thin-skinned at all. It was something that I said off the cuff. But in terms of that school, which is a much more serious issue, if it's on the critical list, some of the ones that are on the critical list were closed if they had a large degree of Raac. Now, those children should be being accommodated, and if they're not, if there's not a plan to do that, the school, okay, well, the mitigations that will be put in place for that school are something that the Department for Education will be paying for.
Please, can we use temperate language? Ben Bradley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I offer some reassurance to the House and to parents in Nottinghamshire that the County Council have been working with the Department and with schools for many months to get the surveys in place to make sure we have an accurate picture of our school estate. And as a result of that work, which I'm very grateful for, the sum total of disruption in Nottinghamshire this week is one primary school being delayed in return by a couple of days. That's a good result in the circumstances and this late change of guidance. So really grateful for that work and for their support of the DFE. There will be a massive run on procurement of temporary buildings in the coming days and weeks, no doubt. But there will also be existing temporary buildings on school estates that are underused or unused. Academy trusts won't naturally talk to each other about that. I wonder if the department might consider helping to facilitate making sure that those existing buildings end up in the most appropriate places at the right time.
Mr.
Well, I thank my honourable friend and also for all the work that he's done and his council done. They've been exemplary in getting on top of this issue. In terms of the temporary buildings, I'm very happy to have a further discussion. At the moment, we have 3 suppliers. We have a lot of stock that we are getting ready to enable it to be utilised. But if there is also underutilised stock elsewhere, then that's something that we'd be happy to consider.
Mohammed Yazin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. In 2016, the Levelling Up Secretary admitted his 2010 ditching of Labour's Building School for Future programme was one of his worst mistakes. In 2011, a High Court judge said the cancellation of the programme amounted to an abuse of power. Despite years of warnings, the government has done very little to ensure our public buildings are safe. Is the Secretary of State ashamed of this record, and will she apologise to taxpayers who want to know why they have to pay so much for so little?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. And I would just like to point out to the honourable gentleman that the priority school building programme schools were 1/3 cheaper per square metre than the schools built under the Building Schools for the Future programme. That is a fact from the NAO in 2017.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new, much-needed special educational needs and disability free school was announced in March 2023 in the East Riding. Can the Secretary of State confirm that there will be no delay to the building of this free school and that it will not be following the advice of the former Education Permanent Secretary, who said that free school programmes should be second to safety and therefore at risk?
Well, I look in particular at the honourable lady's free school, special school, but we announced 7 new free schools, special schools in the summer holiday as well, and it's very much part of our building more places for special educational needs, which we know are badly needed in many constituencies.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I wish to impress upon the Secretary of State, Mr Speaker, that repairs must not come from current education budgets, since in Scotland these budgets are already reeling from Labour's appalling PFI legacy, which sold out the taxpayer. So can the Secretary of State offer me assurance that the UK Government will provide all necessary additional financial support to all affected schools in Scotland, such as the PE block in Ardrossan Academy in my constituency? And while she's weighing up the funding issue, can I ask her to bear in mind that in the last financial year, Scotland's capital budget was cut by £185 million in the face of soaring inflation?
Well, I do sympathise with the honourable lady. The PFI deals that were put all over the country and blight the public sector still today, a hangover legacy of the last time Labour were in power. There's a very good reason why we should not trust them with our public services again.
Kevan Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I have two schools affected. One St Bede's in my own constituency, and St Leonard's in the City of Durham constituency, where a lot of pupils travel from my constituency too, that are being closed. Parents speaking to them over the weekend are both concerned about their education, frustrated and angry, frankly, at the way the government has dealt with this. She said in a statement earlier on that Department will be working all weekend. Now, I spoke to one of her civil servants this morning, a very nice gentleman, I've got to say, but he told me nothing frank, because he had nothing to tell me. I also spoke to the head of St Bede's school this morning, who made sterling efforts on Friday to try and get alternative provision in community centres and other buildings in the area, only to be told that her department has got to sign these things off. Now, this is chaos, Minister, the way it's been dealt with in County Durham. And can I just say in terms of St Leonard's, if the funding which was earmarked for the rebuilding of St Leonard's had gone through and not been stopped by his government, rather than making the ideological decision which they made in 2011 to bring a free school to the City of Durham, which then closed 3 years later, costing £4 million. That's £4 million that could have been spent on education in Durham.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. Just so he's aware, in terms of, and actually for all members, this was announced on Thursday. Today is Monday. In that time, we have identified the buildings, we've got the porter cabins, we've written to everybody, we've got the contracts for the porter cabins. In a few days, we have actually stood up a helpline system, a caseworker system. If there are specific, I mean, I think they will be getting, working with the caseworker, they will be getting all the mitigations in place, but it was a policy that was announced last Thursday.
Mary Kelly-Foy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. What happened last Friday was an absolute disgrace. My constituents were thrown into disarray when St Leonard's had to close its school. Is the Minister aware of the difficulty and distress that this has caused? Childcare and work had to be rearranged, all at the last minute, all against the backdrop of a cost of living crisis. So what support will be offered to those vulnerable pupils and families, especially those on free school meals? And will there be a promise of financial support for repairs to the school? And when can the school expect a timescale to make their school safe? And I must say, Mr Deputy Speaker, the local authority and the Department for Education have been pretty useless, and I want to put on record my thanks to Durham University, who are stepping up and trying to be as proactive as they can to help solve this situation.
Well, of course, for parents and for children, it was very difficult, and you know, I have said that if I could have done it any other way, I would have done. But faced with the information that I had, I thought that was the best thing to do to keep children safe in our schools. And I know it was very difficult, and the timing was very difficult. In terms of the repairs, yes, I can assure the Honourable Lady that first of all there'll be support to mitigate whatever the situation is in St Leonard's, but then also when we look to in the future whether it's refurbished or repaired.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thousands of parents will be concerned at the start of a school term and their children once again locked out of school and not getting face-to-face teaching, because they know the consequences of this policy. We've already seen it during COVID. Schools closed down, and we're still living with the consequences of educational achievement, the disproportionate impact on the poor, long-term school absence, mental health problems, etc. And I hope that this is not going to be the default position of the Department of Education every time they identify risk in a school. But could the Minister tell us what discussions she has had with Northern Ireland officials? Have the number of schools been identified in Northern Ireland? And is the approach in Northern Ireland going to be, if schools are identified, then they will be closed?
We've written to Northern Ireland officials and offered support. In terms of remote learning, it is absolutely our priority to minimise the remote learning as much as possible. The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. We've seen the impacts on our children still today in schools, and the average for the schools that are in the critical, so the 52, which were mitigated, was 6 days for remote learning, but we're trying to minimise that as much as possible.
Paulette Hamilton.
I have 40 schools in my constituency, which is one of the poorest in the UK. They simply can't afford another crisis. They've faced austerity, coronavirus, energy bills and strikes. What support can be offered to schools and parents in Erdington who will be affected by this? Also, we've talked about other public buildings. How will the Right Honourable Member work to ensure that what has been learnt from what has happened here will be passed on to other areas so we don't make the same mistakes again? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And if there are schools in the Honourable Lady's area, then she will have been identified. They will have been identified, and we will be working with the caseworker to mitigate those as soon as possible. If there are those that are suspected, we'll be working to make sure that we are surveying them as much as possible. In terms of the wider public realm, I mean, obviously schools are quite specific because there are many buildings, 64,000 blocks, and most of the time they don't have an estate manager. So they're managed in different ways, but every department has their own programme.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I was waiting for the Honourable Gentleman to hop in ahead of me there, but there we are. Can I first of all thank the Secretary of State very much for the answers that she's given. And the introduction that the Secretary of State gives referred to England, Wales and Northern Ireland, because there's issues in Northern Ireland as well. It's a devolved matter, education, I understand that, but St Field High School, for instance, according to media reports of the weekend, is one of those schools in my constituency is having some of the repair work done. So can the Secretary of State confirm what discussions have taken place in Cabinet to ensure that schools in Northern Ireland have the help and assistance in place to make safe their buildings, and with a restricted budget must take in the increased costs of these works in Northern Ireland due to the logistics of this very specialised work? Mr Deputy Speaker, thank you.
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and as I mentioned before, we have written to the officials in Northern Ireland and offered to have meetings to pass on information and best practice that we have, and also to work with them closely.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And we've all listened carefully to what ministers have been saying. And the Prime Minister said that it was completely and utterly wrong to blame him for failing to fully fund a programme to rebuild England's schools when he was Chancellor. But isn't it in fact the case that what was truly, completely and utterly wrong, and what is completely and truly wrong, is that this Prime Minister and this government to pursue an ideological fixation with austerity which has caused the lives of children in this country to be put at critical risk.
The honourable gentleman, I'll give him some good news. We're actually going to be funding schools more than we ever have before, £60 billion a year, and the overall capital budget, as I've said before, is £19 billion. And that's from the spending review in 21, of which £7 billion is allocated to 23-24. And we've been continuing the same building rate of new schools for a long time.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. At least 4 schools in my constituency of Leicester East have been affected by the Raac issue. The Secretary of State will be aware that Willowbrook Mead Primary Academy had to close without notice, with children being taught online. The Secretary of State's letter warning about the danger arrived after children and staff had been back in dangerous buildings in Leicester for 3 days because schools there reopened a week earlier than most. The start of the school term in Leicester was last week. What does the Secretary of State have to say to the parents, carers and guardians in my constituency whose vulnerable children were put at risk by the government's lack of prompt action, investment and care?
I'm aware, as the Honourable Lady says, that Leicester starts schools a little earlier. However, the information that we used to base our decision only really came towards the end of August. So when we acted, we had to act on new information, and it was that triggered the change. And of course, you know, I am very sorry to parents and to children, because it has caused disruption to the start of their year, which is the last thing I wanted to do. But my priority is keeping them safe in school.
I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for her statement today, responding to well in excess of 60 backbench questions for over an hour and a half. Thank you very much. I'm going to take the personal statement first, and then I'm going to come on to points of order. Personal statement, Gavin Williamson.
With your permission, Mr Deputy Speaker, I wish to make a personal statement regarding an exchange that occurred on September the 13th and 14th, 2022, between myself and the then Chief Whip, the Right Honourable Member for Aldridge Brownhills. During this exchange, I used intemperate and inappropriate language, which I regret and I apologised for shortly after. My behaviour led to a complaint. The complaint was initially dismissed by the Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards. However, this decision was appealed and subsequently reversed by the independent expert panel. I accept the decision that my conduct constituted a breach of the bullying and harassment policy and have since reflected on my behaviour. I reiterate my apology made to the complainant following the breach. I apologise to them again now, and I apologise to the House fully and unreservedly. I will do my utmost to ensure this does not happen again.
Thank you very much. We now move on to points of order. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. On a previous point of order on the 12th of July, I said that I had not received a reply to the letter that I had sent to the Prime Minister on the 17th of January. And I confirmed that I had not received a response to this letter at this point. However, in the spirit of my elected representatives' Codes of Conduct Bill, which aims to restore trust in our politics, I wish to clarify that I had received a separate response to my June follow-up letter to the Prime Minister from the noble Baroness Neville Rolfe on the 7th of July, and I've written to her to make this clear and to thank her. As such, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd be grateful if I could amend the record.
I'm sure the House is incredibly grateful that the Honourable Lady has done so in such a speedy fashion. Thank you very much. Point of order, Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's important to note that anything that's said in this House is noted by Hansard in perpetuity. Mr Deputy Speaker, can you please clarify whether it is in order for members of Parliament to ask for their family history to be forgotten? Former MP for Edinburgh, Antoinette Sandbach, her family was deeply involved in the slave trade and amassed wealth as a result of this brutality. Former member has threatened the University of Cambridge with legal action after an historian spoke of her ancestors' role in the slave trade. While her recent public apology for their role is welcome and necessary, those who sit in this House should not use their position to silence those who shine a light on the horrors of the past. And on a related point, Mr Speaker, would you also agree that it is important that members cooperate fully with any research going on to establish parliamentarians' links to the transatlantic slave trade?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her point of order and a forward notice of that, and I appreciate that the Honourable Member feels strongly about the importance of academic research into the transatlantic slave trade, as all of us in this House do or should do. But the participation of individual members and former members in such research is a matter for those concerned and not the Chair. But the Honourable Lady has made her point of view known and it stands on the record. Thank you very much. I'm now going to move on, and we come to the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill Programme number 3 motion. Programme motion to be moved formally. The question is, as on the order papers, many of those opinions say aye. Aye. Contrary no, I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill. Consideration